Hello everyone, it's the Exhausted Dad, and in this video we're here to dissect the many aspects of an extraction shooter and discuss how they differ in the many different games within the genre. The purpose of this video is twofold. Firstly, I want to set up a standard and checklist that my videos will use going forward, be they reviews, previews, or overviews. I'll always be breaking down games to these parts. Secondly, it might just be a useful tool in understanding the variety that comes within the extraction shooter genre that is a lot more than just Escape from Tarkov Clones, and might help you find the right game for you, if you're not hopelessly addicted to one already, that is. The PvP PvE Spectrum. This is probably the biggest difference you will find in an extraction shooter. Most extraction shooters are a mix and call themselves PvE PvP. For the uninitiated, that means player versus environment versus player. But there is an increasing number of extraction games coming out that focus 100% on the PvE. They could be purely single-player experiences like Zero Sievert, which attempts to recreate almost the entire Escape from Tarkov experience in a single-player top-down game with an indie pixel aesthetic, or something like Witchfire, which uses the extraction shooter formula to create a unique roguelite experience with a very satisfying progression system and core game loop. They can of course also be co-op, with games like Incursion Red River creating a very similar experience to Escape from Tarkov with your friends, minus any PvP element to it, or The Forever Winter, which uses the extraction gameplay loop and gear fear, but places you in the shoes of a random scavenger caught in the middle of a war, and not a badass soldier or PMC. Then you have the PvE PvP games, which cover the vast majority of extraction games. These will have AI enemies running around which players can battle with, as well as other players to fight. I call this a spectrum in the title because different extraction shooters will prioritize the PvP or PvE more than the other. You might get a game like Grey Zone Warfare, where the PvE is the main content, with the AI being very deadly and objectives sending you deep into AI-infested territory. But you might encounter enemy squads who just happen to be there. Or you'll get games with a much higher PvP focus where the AI is generally very mindless and barely a threat, save for a named boss here or there. These trash mob enemies exist only to force you into loud gunfights to draw players to each other and encourage more player-on-player violence. This probably includes most of the PvE PvP extraction shooters, but as an example you've got Delta Force Operations, which has a very Call of Duty feel to the AI combat, and they generally don't pose a threat at all. Or Arena Breakout, where they are a bit more of a threat thanks to the more realistic bullet damage, but are generally pretty brain dead and unlikely to sneak up on a player with their many vocal callouts giving away their position. Somewhat rare, but not totally non-existent, is the pure PvP extraction shooter. These games do not have AI enemies running around, and any noise you hear absolutely will come from another player. I can only think of one example of this, and that would be Vigor, the third-person, primarily console-based post-apocalyptic extraction shooter. Without any AI, the game is forced to have clever map design and funnels players to the same points of interest, and uses a lot of high-value map events to draw players to each other. It mostly works, but I'll have to do another video on Vigor and the many things that have gone wrong with it someday. For the rest of the video, I'm going to try to stick to PvE PvP extraction shooters. Also, if you haven't clocked it by now, I'll refer to Escape from Tarkov as it was the game to popularize, if not invent, the genre, but I don't actually play it and will not be using it in any of my examples. So if it seems like an obvious choice and I don't mention it, that's why. Just assume whenever I mention Arena Breakout Infinite that Tarkov would also fit, because as far as I'm concerned they are pretty identical. Loot or objective focus. Generally, all extraction games have some amount of looting and quests, tasks, or objectives. But what we're discussing here is the priority they give over the two. This is important as it will also affect just how optional PvP encounters are. Most games are loot focused. These will still have tasks you need to complete, but each player or squad will have their own tasks that will differ from the other players. This gives the player choice on how risky they want to be. They can avoid the high traffic areas with the best loot and just sneak around, focus on getting what they can and getting out alive. Or they can risk it all in hopes of opening a high value safe, fighting some players and leaving with huge winnings. Delta Force and Arena Breakout are good examples of this. Objective-focused extraction shooters de-emphasize the loot, which is still there, but it's more a case of finding what you need to survive, like ammo and meds, while aiming to complete a specific objective that all players are after. In a loot-focused game, you can define your own goals, but in objective-focused ones, everyone's after the same thing, and there can only be one winner, or winning squad. So, obviously, the PvP is going to be a lot more intense. There aren't many examples of objective-focused extraction games right now. The only active one I can think of is Hunt Showdown, where everyone is competing to extract with the boss bounty. Hawked was a pretty decent one, but it's near impossible to find a match nowadays, and there is another one in development called Beautiful Light, which looks very promising, but I can't go into detail because it's not currently playable. Session-based or persistent instances. This one is a bit more subtle, but can drastically change the feel of an extraction shooter. Most of the current games are session-based. What I mean by that is that a game session starts when everyone is ready. All players spawn at the same time and have a limited amount of time before the game is over. Anyone who hasn't extracted dies. Delta Force, Arena Breakout, Vigor, pretty much every game I've mentioned so far uses the session-based approach. But there are persistent instance games too. What I mean by persistent instances is that there is no start or end to a round. Players just constantly drop in and out of an instance that never ends. I tell a lie. I did mention one game that uses persistent instances, and that's Grey Zone Warfare. Other games include the mech extraction shooter Sin Duality Echoes of Ada, and the upcoming game Exoborn, which is in closed beta, so I'm not allowed to show you any footage. There are benefits to both approaches, and it's hard to say which one is straight up better. A session-based game will have a more natural flow to it, and doesn't need to have a system for respawning enemies and loot. So the map is more readable in the sense that if you come across bodies, you know a player has been here. If the AI is still alive and boxes unlooted, you're probably the first person here. You can usually get a feel of where players will be based on how long a match has been going on, and can make a good guess of how many players, if any, are still in the match based on who you've killed, bodies you've come across, and extractions you might have heard or seen. You might let your guard down after wiping out 3 or 4 squads, knowing the likelihood of anyone else being around is quite low. The major downside to this approach is that if the game isn't as popular, it can take a long time to find a match. Obviously that's not an issue while the game's at its height in popularity, like Delta Force is, but can make a game feel completely dead when you're waiting 10 minutes or more in the matchmaker, with games like Hawked or Marauders. Alternatively, they could use this method but not have a lower limit to the number of players, so you can just get in an empty match and still play the game, like in the medieval fantasy extraction game Expedition Agartha. So obviously the main benefit for the persistent instance is that there just isn't any queuing. You click play and you load in, regardless of whether other players are there or not. There is practically no predictability in matches, as players are spawning in and leaving constantly as you play. Whether this is a good thing or not is entirely down to taste. If the game isn't smart about its spawning, however, this can be a problem, as you might get really unlucky and spawn right next to another player or squad who wipe you out before you know what's happening. This has been a problem in Sin Duality, for example. But apart from that, it creates a pretty tense experience where you never feel safe because you never know if someone's around, if they just spawned in looking for a fight or are on their way to extract carrying juicy loot. These games can feel relatively alive with much lower player bases because you can get in a match at any point. It's just a case of whether you actually run into players or not. The player economy. This one's a bit more binary. Either the game has an auction house or flea market, or it doesn't. I've tried to be objective up to now and not offer an opinion on what is or isn't better in any other sections, as it really is a matter of taste. I prefer PvP, for example, but I can totally see the appeal to a completely PvE extraction shooter that's a bit more chill. But when it comes to a player economy, or lack thereof, I'm straight up going to say it. Extraction shooters with a player economy are better. Games without a player economy will have more control over your gear progression, and that could be seen as a good thing, meaning players need to focus on their quests and vendor reputation to unlock the better gear. But this usually results in huge disparity between long-term players and newcomers who might feel they have no chance of defending themselves. I honestly believe this was one of the biggest contributing factors to killing Marauders. With the player market, finding loot is a lot more exciting, as even if you have no use for it, selling it to other players usually results in higher earnings than just selling it to an AI vendor, and fluctuating prices can make selling items at the right time its own little minigame. It also means it's much easier to gear up and get back in the fight, being able to buy gear, ammo, consumables, etc. from other players. There's also a very satisfying downtime in between raids where you just put things on the market and watch the money roll in. Honestly, selling your loot can be nearly as addictive as actually going out and getting it in the first place. Delta Force and Arena Breakout both have a fantastic player economy, with junk and treasure items being used to trade in for better gear from AI vendors, giving value to all the random crap you find in Raid. Vigor and Synduality do not have a player market, and are honestly lesser games because of it. Recovery mechanics. What happens when you had a bunch of terrible runs and lost all your gear? Are you expected to just run in with no armor, no weapons, and hope to goodness you can find something? Well, that's where the recovery mechanic comes in. This is an alternative way to earn gear, or a low-risk run that gives you free gear, just enough to survive the AI and a player if you're lucky enough to get the drop on them. In most games, this will take the form of a scav run, where you spawn in as a member of the AI faction with low-tier gear and can just run around and collect loot. Either avoid players or get really lucky and take one out, earning yourself a free full set of gear. In a scav run, you tend to have the advantage of AI recognizing you as one of their own, so you won't have to fight them, making it all the easier to keep a low profile. This is exactly what Arena Breakout does. Delta Force has a similar mechanic, but instead of spawning in as a scav, you pick from predefined loadouts, using tickets to pay for them which you get free over time, or higher value tickets for better loadouts that you get through events and quests. Functionally, these are nearly identical to a scav run, with the only difference being that you still play as your main character and are attacked by the AI just like a normal gear run. The other option is simply having gear that anyone can claim for free, such as is the case with Marauders spawning a basic rig and a Luger in your ship at the start of every run, and Synduality with the Jackbox mech. But these are usually an even bigger disadvantage than a scav run and will enforce a very passive playstyle until you can gear up. Vigor, which just has to be different, has neither free claimable gear or scav runs, but has a couple of no-risk deathmatch modes which reward you with loot box crates that can include weapons, ammo, consumables, and resources. Obviously, these recovery modes aren't only available when you run out of gear and can make for a nice low-risk run when you want something a bit less intense, but they tend to have limited uses to encourage people to actually use their gear. In the case of scav runs, it's usually like half an hour or longer cooldown before you run out another scav run, and in Delta Force gear ticket system, you get a free ticket every couple of hours or so and can stack up to about 10. Solo or squads. Most extraction shooters are designed with squad play in mind. You can queue up on your own, but will be at a huge disadvantage if you run into a full squad of players working together. If you're lucky, a game might have a solo-only queue where you will only ever queue up against other solo players. For some reason, despite this feature being heavily requested in literally every extraction shooter ever, it's surprisingly rare. Out of all the games I've mentioned so far, Vigor is the only one with a solo queue that is separate from the squad queues. Funnily enough, Synduality only has a solo queue with no way to play with friends outside of trying to matchmake at the same time and hoping to land in the same instance. Lost Light is another extraction shooter that has a solo queue, which I do play occasionally, but it's really bad. It's a bad mobile port, and the solo queue is literally the only reason I play it. A lot of people do enjoy the challenge of going in solo against full squads, but it can make these games very inaccessible to people who don't have a group of friends ready to jump in with them. Most of these games do at least have a squad fill system so you can find people to play with in-game, but playing with randos is scary and unpredictable, so I don't really recommend it. Still, if you're not going to have a solo queue, then it's better to have the option to squad fill than not have it. Marauders. Level of simulation. Okay, so we've covered all the major differences between extraction shooters, but there's a few points I'll group together under the title of level of simulation. These will determine just how arcadey or simulation-y the game is. First of all, there's the armor and ammo system. Does the game have different levels of armor and bullets with better or worse penetration? In Arena Breakout and Delta Force, if your ammo doesn't have enough of a penetration level to break through armor, you'll be at a disadvantage as you won't be able to damage the player without completely smashing their armor first, not accounting for the leg meta where shooting legs does less damage but ignores armor. But higher penetration ammo is going to be a lot more expensive, so it's a tough decision what to bring with you. It does however mean that finding high level armor or ammo is very rewarding. Other games like Vigor, for example, will only have one ammo type per weapon and either no armor or treat armor simply as a percentage damage mitigation. Next up is survival mechanics, particularly food and drink. Lost Lights and Arena Breakout have got these, though Honestly, they can feel a bit superfluous. They're just there for the sake of being there, but in a persistent instance game like Grey Zone Warfare, it makes more sense as it could be what determines how long your raid can be, before you have to go back and resupply in place of having an actual raid timer. And finally there's the health system. The more arcadey games will have a straight up health bar where either you have health and are alive, or you have 0 health and are dead. Healing items would just increase your health. Simple. More advanced systems will simulate limb and organ damage, requiring tourniquets or bandages to stop bleeding and surgical kits to fix organ damage. A game like Delta Force might do a bit of both, where your health bar determines whether you are alive or not, but various debuffs can occur from bleed, limb damage, etc. Or it can focus entirely on the limb organ damage simulation, like in Arena Breakout, where fully damaging the head or chest will result in death, damaging individual limbs will cause debuffs, but there is otherwise no health bar. With that, I feel like we've covered every aspect that matters in an extraction shooter when trying to compare them or pick one to play, apart from maybe the wipe system, where some games, like Tarkov, will have regular wipes, completely resetting progress and evening the playing field, and others won't. So your progress is more of a permanent thing. I personally hate the wipe system, and I'm very unlikely to stick around a game that doesn't respect my time like that, so I didn't really cover it. Most of the games I covered here don't have any wipes, apart from being in early access and needing to wipe the slate clean after a significant enough update, but that's a reality of the development and not so much a game feature. Thank you for taking the time to watch the whole video. Please leave a comment, let me know what you prefer for each of these sections, and if there's any aspect that's important to you that you feel I should have covered. If you like this video, then like the video, and consider subscribing. This is a new channel and needs all the help it can get. Future videos will be a mix of gameplay, edited clip compilations, as well as reviews, previews, and overviews of various extraction shooters. Ideally, I would like to do a video on every extraction shooter that can be played. I might do more game-agnostic videos like this if I can think of interesting topics to cover too. So if any of that appeals to you, I hope to see you again. Bye bye!